Alright, welcome to a YouTube lecture in which we talk about the nervous system, control and communication. So, the nervous system is all about how we process information through the body. There are two basic divisions to the nervous system. We have the central and peripheral nervous systems. The central nervous system consists of the brain and the spinal cord. So if it's in the brain or if it's a part of the spinal cord, it's central nervous system. If it is a neuron or nerve anywhere else, anything that is not the brain and spinal cord, that is a neuron or a nerve, is in the peripheral nervous system. You can think about this as the nerves running through your body. So nerves and neurons outside of the central nervous system. We'll talk about the main cell of the nervous system, which is, of course, the neuron. If you see the prefix ner, that means we are talking about nerves or neurons. So, ner. I don't know why I did that. Okay, so a neuron is a nerve cell. It is what processes sends and receives information. There are three basic parts to a neuron. We've done this before, but might as well review it. There's the cell body. The cell body of the neuron is where we find the nucleus. It's also where we find the organelles and most of the cytoplasm in the cell. It's the largest portion, or the largest volume portion. Anyway, that's the cell body. Coming off the cell body are multiple tree-like branches, right? These are called the dendrites. The dendrites branch off of the cell body. You can think of them as the receiving end of a neuron when it comes to information signals or nerve impulses. Right? So if you have neuron A, it sends an impulse and it connects up with the dendrites of neuron B. And so the impulse from neuron A travels to neuron B, and the dendrites are what first receive the signal from that impulse. And if that signal from neuron A says continue this impulse, then the dendrite starts an impulse and it moves down the dendrite across the cell body and along the axon, which is a long tail-like extension of the neuron. So it is very long. It often branches into multiple terminal ends at the end of the axon, and each one connects to one or more dendrites of additional cells. Axons are often covered in fatty sheaths called myelin. We'll talk about myelin a little later. And anyway, this is the transmitting end of the neuron. So, our signal started at the dendrites, continued across the cell body, and then passed along the axon. And it's transmitted to neuron C, where the axon of neuron B meets up with the dendrites of neuron C. And so we get this vast network of interconnected axons and dendrites sending signals to and from each other. Well, sending signals down axons to dendrites. So it's pretty awesome. Here's our nice little diagram. Here's the cell body right here. We can identify it because of this green blob, which is the nucleus here. And then coming off of it, we have all these tree-like branches. These are the dendrites, and the terminal end of each of these branches will be connected to one or more axons. So if this is our neuron B right here, we have neuron A up here, and an impulse comes down neuron A, where A meets up with B here at a dendrite. That impulse results in a signal that says, hey, neuron B, continue that impulse. It starts at that connection there in the dendrite, continues along the dendrite, down the cell body, and then to the transmitting end, the axon. This is the long tail-like extension. You can see here we have our little cells secreting fat onto the axon. So this is that myelin sheath. And then it branches out into little ends. So the signal comes down the transmitting end, goes over to one of these ends here, and sends a little signal across to the dendrites of neuron C. And here's just a little bit more detailed of an image showing some different kinds of neurons. So this is right here up top a sensory neuron, say a little receptor in the skin. So the receptors are actually just naked axons. And in this case, sensory receptors actually start with an axon and a sensory structure. And if that sensory structure is triggered, then the information starts traveling down the axon and up to the dendrites that connect up to the next neuron. And say that goes to the central nervous system, which processes the sensory information, and then it may send a signal back down to your muscles. So it connects down to this interneuron, the neuron between the sensory and the motor neuron. Between, pretty simple there. So signal from the CNS comes down here, travels to the motor neuron, and here we have our traditional dendrites receiving the signal, travels along the cell body, down the axon, where the terminal ends connect up with muscles, where we have our motor units. So in the body, we call the neurons nerves. And nerves are arranged into sort of a certain structure. A nerve is actually a bundle of neurons, specifically the axons of neurons. See, the cell body and the dendrites of nerves in your body are actually right up close to your spinal cord. And it's the axons that travel throughout the body. And so a nerve is actually a big bundle of axons that will then split off, and the nerve will branch out, and all these axons will go to different places in order to do different things. So maybe they're sensory structures, who knows? So if a nerve is severed, how easily do you think it heals? Right? How often do you hear about people regaining full function or full feeling after the severed nerve? There's a reason it's not incredibly common, and that's simply because nerves, being just axons, don't have a whole lot of effective healing. Basically, when you have a nerve and it is severed, say this is my nerve, and it gets severed there, it will grow out in a random direction from each side of the severing. And if they happen to meet up, it will form a new connection. Sometimes it fully connects and you regain full feeling or full function. Sometimes it partially connects and you only get some feeling or function. And sometimes they just fail to connect and you lose feeling or function. That's because we're dealing just with axons. They're not really great at healing. They just sort of grow out in a random direction, and you hope that they connect up and make the correct connections. So let's talk about that nerve impulse. A nerve impulse is simply an electrical signal traveling down the membrane of a neuron. We call this an action potential. The AP, the action potential. This is the actual impulse that travels down the membrane. When they say your brain sends electrical signals, it's actually action potentials that are traveling. So I mentioned they travel along the membrane. So how do we generate an impulse along the membrane? Well, it happens through something called depolarization. And in order to fully define that, we have to talk about what's called the resting potential of a membrane. The resting potential of a membrane is the default charge on the inside of the membrane versus the outside of the cell. The resting potential, or the sort of default potential, is the inside of the membrane being more negative than the outside. So it's normally lower, the charge inside is normally lower than the charge outside. And depolarization is when the charge difference becomes zero. In other words, when the charge inside is equal to the charge outside, it actually triggers the impulse that travels down the membrane. So an action potential is literally just an impulse that is generated when we have equal charge on the inside versus the outside, and that equal charge propagates down the membrane from the dendrites to the axon. So the resting potential is sort of the normal or default charge difference, lower inside versus outside. Depolarization is when the inside charge becomes equivalent to the outside, and even becomes higher than the outside. And this is all governed by sodium potassium. If you remember that sodium-potassium pump, when we talked way back when about active transport, it would pump out 3 sodium, which have a +1 charge, a single positive charge, and then it would pump in 2 potassium. Each potassium has a single positive charge. So essentially, we pump out 3 positive charge, pump in 2 positive charge, and essentially lose a positive charge each time the sodium-potassium pump works. So as long as the sodium-potassium pump is functioning, then we maintain the resting potential. In order to generate our action potential, basically we just open some floodgates and allow sodium to flood back into the neuron. And as the sodium with its positive charge floods in, we get depolarization and the charge inside increases until we generate the action potential, which causes depolarization to continue all along the membrane, just all the way down. And it travels from the dendrites, down the cell body, down the axons, until we reach what's called the synapse. See, an axon from one neuron and a dendrite from another, so the axon of neuron A and the dendrite of neuron B, are not actually physically connected. There's a little junction between them, a space, and that's called the synapse. So this little space where an axon meets a dendrite is kind of cool, because an action potential cannot just jump across that space and trigger, depolarization on the dendrite. So the action potential from neuron A travels down the axon until we get to this terminal end, and it can't just jump to the dendrite of neuron B. Instead, we have to send a signal, and that signal is a neurotransmitter. Neurotransmitter is basically any chemical that's released into a synapse that causes a response of some sort. Produces a response in a neuron or nerve cell. There are large numbers of different effects you can get from different neurotransmitters. Some neurotransmitters cause the impulse to just continue. There are neurotransmitters that actually inhibit action potentials, so they stop the impulse from continuing along neuron B. So with those inhibitory neurotransmitters, basically, if you have like neuron D connected to neuron B, and the impulse comes down the axon of neuron D, sends a neurotransmitter across to neuron B and says, hey, send this impulse. Neuron B would send the impulse. But over here we have neuron A, and its axon has a synapse with the dendrite of B, and when the impulse comes down neuron A to the axon, to the synapse, it releases a neurotransmitter that says, don't send impulses. And it becomes sort of an additive game. Are there more of the inhibitory neurotransmitters bound in the synapse than the excitatory neurotransmitters, the ones that tell it to continue? That's a little extra complicated, but I like it. It's really cool information that the axon has these vesicles filled with chemical compounds that are released and have different effects. So when our neuron A releases the neurotransmitter into the synapse, it binds to receptors on the dendrite of neuron B. And once they're bound, they trigger their response until they're actually physically removed from the receptor. So if it's excitatory, if the chemical says continue this impulse, as long as that chemical is on the receptor, will continue generating impulses. And the impulses will continue to be generated until that excitatory neurotransmitter is removed by some good old-fashioned enzymes. So, let's talk a little bit about myelin. So, I remember saying, I spoke about those little fatty sheaths that cover the axons of neurons. So they have a really interesting specific function. See, an action potential travels down every micrometer, every single part of the membrane. When an action potential is triggered over here at the dendrite, it will continue down the membrane all along the cell body, all the way down the membrane of the axon, where it triggers some kind of neurotransmitter. This can be somewhat slow. So we have the white matter of the nervous system that's covered in fatty myelin sheaths. So this is in some or all of the nerves in your body because these cause signals to travel very quickly. So they're a little fatty structure, and they insulate the axon such that an action potential actually jumps between the little spaces of the myelin. So they call it the node of Ranvier. You definitely don't have to remember node of Ranvier. But the impulse jumps between the little nodes, the little junctions between the myelin pieces. And because the impulse jumps, moves much faster. Without myelin, an action potential travels down the entire length, and it goes relatively slowly, something like 0.5 to 10 kilometers an hour. Whereas with myelin, we do little jumps between the nodes, so the action potential jumps, and it travels much faster. So, I was talking meters per second. So it's 0.5 to 10 meters per second when you don't have myelin. That's how quickly an impulse can travel along a uninsulated neuron, between 1 and 22 miles an hour. With myelin, you get 90 to 150 meters per second, or 200 to 300 plus miles per hour. That's really important because I kind of want the information of me stepping on a rusty nail right away, right? I don't want to have to wait for the delay of that signal being sent all along each and every neuron. Instead, I have myelin along the peripheral nervous system nerves, and then I have myelin in the spinal cord and myelin in the brain. And the signal just jumps between the junctions in the myelin sheaths, in between the nodes, and travels extremely quickly. So it's almost instantaneous. There's a little bit of wind. Hopefully that doesn't screw with this too much, because I'm really enjoying being outside on the porch. So here we're actually looking at white matter. And any time you see white matter in the brain, that is myelinated axons. So a large portion of the brain is heavily myelinated. Here's a sort of cross-section of a spinal cord, sort of, we call it a transverse section, and you're looking down. And all around here are the white matter of the spinal cord. And this butterfly-looking thing is actually gray matter, unmyelinated. So this is the white matter that sends those signals super fast. And of course, here's a nerve, and the nerve axons are myelinated, because you have to go all the way from your fingertip, down your arm, upper arm, to the brain. You want that to be fast, so that there is no perceived delay between sensory input and processing it. All right, here we go. There are the basic structures of the central nervous system. We have the brain and the spinal cord. The functions of the brain and the spinal cord consist of information processing. When we say that, we mean information gathered from the inside of your body and the outside world are sent along sensory nerves to the central nervous system, where all that information is put together to create some kind of conscious perception of now, right? Because I have sensors telling me what my muscles are doing. I have the photosensors in my eyes telling me how light is interacting with this movement. I have pressure sensors feeling the air movement in my fingertips. There's a lot of information, and it all gets transferred to the brain in order to be processed into your combined perception, so that you're not getting all that information separately. Your central nervous system also controls a large number of the functions in your body. And of course, thinky happens in the brain, central nervous system. And your intensely unreliable memories are formed in the central nervous system. So the general pathway for information gathered from the external and internal environment, which is just sensory information, is that it travels to the central nervous system. So it's gathered in the body, in the peripheral nervous system. And those impulses are sent to the spinal cord. And then they can be either briefly processed in the case of a spinal reflex, and then a motor neuron is activated to cause a muscle action, or it can be passed along up the spinal cord to the brain. And anyway, whatever happens, responses are generated by the central nervous system. And those responses are sent out to the stuff in the peripheral nervous system that will actually do the actions. So we have nerves in the peripheral nervous system. The functions are to carry information to the central nervous system or away from the central nervous system. So the peripheral nervous system collects information and sends it to the central nervous system. At the same time, the peripheral nervous system takes information from the central nervous system and sends it away to the parts of the body that are going to respond to that information. We have sensory nerves. These carry information along the peripheral nerves to the spinal cord and to the brain. So this is sensory information. Sensory nerves carry information to the central nervous system. This can be a lot of things: taste, temperature, pressure, touch, sight, scent, muscle position, pain. All of this is information gathered from the external or internal environment using your sensory nerves. And all of that information is sent to, at the very basic, your spinal cord. And most of it is sent along up to your brain. We also have motor nerves. Motor nerves carry information from the CNS to the body. They carry information away from the central nervous system. The central nervous system processes the information from all the sensory nerves, and it generates a response. And that response is sent along a motor neuron from the CNS to the body, away from the CNS. Motor neurons are connected to muscles and glands. We have the somatic motor neuron, which is connected to skin glands and skeletal muscle. Not skin glands. I'm getting ahead of myself. The somatic motor neuron is specifically connected to skeletal muscle. It provides you voluntary control. Versus the autonomic motor neuron, which provides involuntary control. Your thinky has nothing to do with the response. So, smooth muscle is involuntary, and it's controlled by the autonomic motor neurons. Cardiac muscle, glands, your fight or flight response, and your basic reflexes are all controlled by autonomic motor neurons. Fight or flight being relatively cool. We'll talk about it more when we talk about endocrinology, if we get to that. Essentially, something happens and your brain processes whether to run or fight. Whichever one, your heart beats faster, your eyes dilate and get wider openings, your airways open up to take in more breath, you breathe faster to get in more oxygen, your mouth dries out because you don't need to be actively secreting saliva. That takes energy, and you are trying to do something else, fight or flight. And along those same lines, your digestion shuts down. You don't need to be devoting energy to digesting food if you have to either fight or run from a bear. All right, here we go. Continuing on, let's talk about the actual brain. Enceph is the prefix we'll use whenever we refer to something related to the brain. Encephalitis would be inflammation of brain tissue. The brain is located, amazingly enough, inside your skull. There's some basic important parts. We have the medulla oblongata. Medulla oblongata is considered the very base of the brain, the bottom of the brain, where it connects up to the spinal cord. We'll also mention the cerebellum, which has a lot to do with, forgetting the word, balance. And then we have the thalamus, the cerebrum. So the thalamus does some hormonal control of various other glands in the body, and the cerebrum is your thinky bits. All right, so first we'll hit up the medulla oblongata. As I said, it is the lowest portion of the brain at the very bottom, and it's the site where the brain connects up to the spinal cord. Motor and sensory pathways actually cross from the right side to the left side of the body and vice versa in the medulla oblongata. So you have information coming up and then it crosses. It produces some wonky stuff. For instance, if you have a stroke on the left side of your brain, then the right side of your body will be feeling the effects of that stroke. Your reflex, a number of your reflex centers are located in the medulla oblongata. So, for instance, whether or not you speed up your breathing rate, so your breathing rate is controlled at a basic level by the medulla oblongata, and it can also result in, it can also release signals that result in an increase or decrease in your heart rate. I say decrease just to be fair, but I kind of think the reflex center there just can speed up the heart rate. And then once it stops sending the signal, the heart rate returns to its standard heart-controlled beat. It can also alter blood pressure, increase your blood pressure. So, very important to fight or flight because it can get you breathing more deeply and quickly. It can pump your heart, get your heart pumping faster, and allow you to inhale large amounts of air, increases your blood pressure in order to quickly get oxygen throughout the body to the muscles that are going to be acting. Here we have the cerebellum. It's kind of a cauliflower-looking thing on one end of the brain, sort of at the bottom. It's connected up to the brain stem, the medulla oblongata. It's the hindbrain, the very back of the brain, primitive tissue, mainly associated with balance and coordination. You can see this little branching pattern in there, which means this tissue has fat. And what are those fatty sheaths called? Yes, myelin. Okay, the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is a collection of nerve cells that also stimulate the release of hormones. It's a very tiny part of the brain, and it is all about homeostasis. So the hypothalamus helps maintain body temperature. It activates when you need to eat, stimulates hunger. It's also where we can stimulate thirst. It can also stimulate or inhibit the pituitary gland. And it does all this through regulation of various body hormones. Remember, a hormone is any chemical that can provoke a response in the central nervous system. So, the hypothalamus will take in sensory information and process it and take action from there, send out responses. Then we have the thalamus. Hypo is Latin or Greek for what now? Yes, below. That is correct. So hypothalamus is below the thalamus. So the thalamus is above the hypothalamus. Hypo below, so it's the below thalamus. The thalamus has the enviable job of filtering the sensory information you get all the time. You are likely seated while watching this. Question is, are you actively processing the information associated with the pressure on your butt from the seat? Are you consciously thinking about that? If you aren't, that's due to the thalamus doing its job. It filters sensory information and gives you the most relevant information. Next up is our good old-fashioned cerebrum. Cerebrum is, again, heavily myelinated. It's the largest portion of the brain. It's also the highest portion of the brain. And it's not, this is the seat of conscious thought and thinking. Your memories are stored in your cerebrum by altering the structure of various neuron networks. So we don't know how to program, the what am I saying? Man, I had a tangent there, and I lost it instantaneously. That sucks. I need to go to sleep, man. Anyway, this is also the seat of your intelligence. Yes, I was talking about memory and how it's stored in networks. We don't know what those networks look like. We can't translate the physical connections between various neurons and determine what memory they're storing. The brain is a largely unknown area. It's really exciting to explore and research because we still don't know a lot about it, and it's just beautifully complicated. So, the largest, highest portion of your brain, that is the seat of conscious thought. So it's where your consciousness and your thinky comes from. It's also where you store memories, and it's the seat of your intelligence. And then various regions in the cerebrum take sensory information from the little sensors in your body, and they integrate them so that you sense them, you put it together and sense it all at once. So, sensory integration, and it's responsible for sending out the responses to that sensory information. We can measure action potential activity in your brain using an EEG, so an electroencephalogram. Basically, you just attach a whole bunch of electrodes to someone's shaved skull, and the electrodes detect what's going on, the electrical impulses, right? So you should see some fairly typical electrical impulses in the brain if someone is a fairly typical normal human being. These are the brain waves. So it's actually a decent way to detect epilepsy. If you suspect someone may have epilepsy, even though they're not having visible muscular seizures, you could put electrodes on them and measure their brain waves, because there is such a thing as an epileptic fit with no muscular spasms. But you will see wacky brain waves. You can also, amazingly enough, detect death with an electroencephalogram. Specifically brain death, right? So if you've got someone who is on artificial life support, you might be able to use an electroencephalogram to very briefly check how much of their brain is actually functioning. So it helps you determine if someone is just brain dead. Now let's talk a little bit about their spinal cord. Prefix for anything spinal cord is myel or myelo. So, if you see myel or myelo, that is spinal cord. Not to be confused with myo. M-Y-O is referencing muscle. M-Y-E-L or M-Y-E-L-O is spinal cord. Your spinal cord travels down the vertebral column. So your vertebrae have a big hole in the center, and so when you stack all your vertebrae up to make your backbone, there's a big hole traveling down, and your spinal cord is in that hole. So the spinal cord takes sensory information from the peripheral nervous system and sends it to the brain. It also takes motor information from the central nervous system, the brain, and sends it out to the peripheral nervous system. So it's sort of a communication hub. The spinal cord is where all the various nerves in the peripheral nervous system meet up, like a nerve elevator. First stop, muscles in your neck. Last stop, just above your tailbone, is nerves that will travel to your groin, your butt, and your legs and feet. So, all that information, all the sensory information from the various parts of your body travel down a peripheral nerve, then they interface with your spinal cord, and then they're sent up to the brain for integration, processing, and response. So, pretty cool. Now, not every response requires the brain to process information. The spinal reflex is a movement in response to a stimulus that occurs without the brain. Basically, when certain kinds of sensory information are sent to the spinal cord can immediately send out a response signal. So, instead of taking the information all the way up the spinal cord to the brain where it's integrated and then a response is sent, instead you have a very quick reflex. So it's a very fast response. It doesn't involve the brain. Basically, your sensor sends information along the nerve to the spinal cord, and then that particular sensory information is immediately processed by the spinal cord and sent out to the muscle, resulting in an extremely fast travel time and response time. So, an example might be the patellar reflex that you get when you go to the doctor. This is a little animated GIF showing that. So here's the little rubber hammer, and they whack your knee, and the sensory information is sent to the spinal cord, and then it transfers, between a little neuron there out to the motor neuron, which tells the muscle to kick your knee. And that seems pretty damn instantaneous when you get it done at the doctor. The crossed extensor reflex is a little more complicated. It involves both sides of the body, both legs. So basically, if you're walking along and your left leg, or your left foot, your left bare foot, steps on glass, right? The damage information, the pain information is all sent along to the spinal cord, and then the spinal cord can take that information and immediately generate a response in which you lift your foot off of the glass. And since you were stepping forward, putting your weight onto the foot you just lifted, then you extend the other leg. So, the cross extensor reflex is so named because it crosses from the left side to the right side. There's a response in both the left and the right side, the reflex response. Of course, over here, I already described the patellar reflex. So, next up is the meninges. The meninges of the brain are really the meninges of the central nervous system. I shouldn't just say brain. They're present along the spinal cord. Are layers, tissue layers that serve various functions, little membranes. There is fluid between specific layers in there. One of the specific layers has fluid. That fluid is the cerebrospinal fluid. It carries nutrients up and down the spinal cord and throughout the brain in order to feed your neurons. Because nutrients normally traveling in the blood are unable to travel out to your neurons because of the blood-brain barrier. I mentioned that way back when I first barely touched on the nervous system. So the blood-brain barrier is caused when a little accessory cell of the nervous system forms a little block around the outside of blood vessels traveling through the brain. And so anything that needs to get to the brain has to first pass through the little cell's block, the blood-brain barrier. Certain things we know can pass, other things absolutely can't pass. For instance, I mentioned in a previous lecture, but worth mentioning again, MS is when your myelin, or when your dopamine-producing neurons start to shut down. And you could treat it really effectively with just dopamine injections into the blood, except that standard dopamine cannot cross the blood-brain barrier. That sucks. The meninges also provide a fair amount of cushioning for the brain and the spinal cord So any kind of movement does not immediately damage the neurons against, like in this case, my skull. So, what is meningitis? Meninges, membranes on the outside of the brain, right? Itis is inflammation. So meningitis is inflammation of the meninges. And that can be very bad because, especially in the skull and really in the spinal cord, you have bones completely surrounding and limiting the ability of that tissue to swell up effectively. So when you have something like meningitis, the tissues and the meninges swell, and then they hit, say, we'll stick with the brain, so they hit the skull. And as it continues to attempt to swell, the skull fully contains it. Hard structure. And that basically causes pressure to increase on your brain, and neurons in your brain may start to die. So meningitis is no joke. Let's talk about other pathologies of the nervous system. So there's good old brain damage. With brain damage, basically you've had parts of your brain that have been damaged in some way. I'm getting ahead of myself. This is the roadmap. So we'll talk about brain damage, then epilepsy, multiple sclerosis, and cerebral palsy. So with brain damage, it can come from a variety of sources, not just the obvious, like getting a nail gun into your brain or someone whacking you with a sledgehammer, being in an accident. You know, a lot of people, when you say brain damage, think physical damage, collisions, or some type of physical impact that has damaged the tissues of the brain. But if you go more than 5 minutes without oxygen, neurons start to die. And if you go more than 15 minutes with hypoglycemia, where you have a critically low level of glucose, neurons start to die. Neurons can only make ATP using glucose. So when you're hypoglycemic, that's some serious shit. You gotta get some sugar in your body. This seems to be relatively persistent because neurons damage to the brain tends to heal relatively poorly. This is because neurons themselves cannot undergo mitosis. In your brain, you have neuronal stem cells that can produce new neurons. So when a neuron is damaged or killed, it's up to stem cells to produce neurons to replace the damaged or killed neurons. Why, you might ask, does this not easily solve the brain damage? Conformation and location. These stem cells are not necessarily right at the perfect location to replace the damaged neurons. Furthermore, it just produces a neuron. It does not automatically produce a neuron with all of the original connections that the damaged neuron made. It seems that your brain is constantly breaking down certain synapses and remaking different synapses with different neurons or different organization to the synapses. So just because you crank out a new neuron to replace the damaged or dead neuron does not mean that new neuron will make all the proper connections, and so you will get poor recovery. So brain damage in general, once you've suffered brain damage, it's slow recovery. Next up is epilepsy. So this is excessive abnormal action potentials or impulses. So during epileptic seizures, your neurons go nuts and just start continuously firing along certain networks. This can result in seizures. So when I say seizures, I'm talking about muscular spasms. When you see someone whose muscles contract and then spasm, right? That is a seizure we're all familiar with. However, there is such a thing as a subclinical seizure, an epileptic event that does not get translated into muscles. Or if it does, it gets translated in such a way that you don't really notice it. For instance, someone's eyes might get extremely twitchy as the little muscles in the eyes spasm, but they may not have the big grand mal seizure effects in the body. So, some, not all epilepsy attacks produce seizures. There seems to be a very strong hereditary component to epilepsy. It runs in families. This is such a strong component that we really only track about a quarter of epilepsy cases to a direct cause, like injury or illness, basically damage to the brain that resulted in epilepsy. This sucks because basically, if you have a direct cause, you may be able to heal it. If you don't have a direct cause, like say it's hereditary epilepsy, you rely on pharmaceuticals to help prevent those neurons from going crazy and constantly firing off electrical impulses randomly all the time. That's an epileptic, I think they used to call it a fit. I don't know if that's proper terminology anymore. But an epileptic event, at least, is when those neurons are firing randomly. If you have epilepsy, it doesn't mean that's always happening. It means every once in a while, depending on the severity of your case, your neurons will start firing rapidly and randomly all the time. Next up is multiple sclerosis, and this is demyelination. This is an autoimmune disorder. So with multiple sclerosis, your own immune system attacks the myelin around the axons. So either in the peripheral nerves or even in the central nervous system, your immune system attacks the myelin and ends up breaking it down, shrinking it, scarring it. And this, for whatever reason, seems to short circuit these little neuronal pathways. And this can impair your vision, impair your memory, impair your judgment, impair your balance, impair your ability to walk. I think a little earlier I may have said multiple sclerosis when I was talking about the dopamine-producing cells in your brain failing. That's Parkinson's, now that I'm thinking of it. Parkinson's disorder or disease is when the dopamine-producing neurons screw up and start to die. And so Parkinson's is the one where if we didn't have a blood-brain barrier, we could just inject someone with dopamine and they'd be fine. So that's an aside, because I suddenly think that I said MS back then. So MS is the autoimmune disorder that attacks the myelin along the axons and scars it, breaks it down, and short circuits the pathways. So the multiple sclerosis is chronic, meaning that it is a long-term disease. Once you have it, it just progresses, and there is no cure, unfortunately. So the good news is it's slow to progress, and we have a number of medications that can help further slow the progression of multiple sclerosis to give someone a somewhat, I don't want to say a somewhat longer life, but to extend their life and to help maintain their quality of life longer. Lastly, we have cerebral palsy. So cerebral palsy is damaged motor areas. So not motor neurons. Motor neurons are peripheral nervous system neurons that connect up to muscles and cause a response. A motor area is a part of your cerebrum, your thinky bits, that is responsible for creating the impulse that gets sent to motor neurons. So it takes information about the body, integrates that information, and generates a response to go to the muscles, the motor areas of the brain. So you have damaged motor areas of the brain, and this can cause a number of different impaired functions based on which motor areas are impaired and how bad the impairment is. So this is a nice little image. I like it. You absolutely do not have to remember the names of these things. Like, I don't want you to have to remember athetoid cerebral palsy, but this is a good example of different effects of damage to different motor areas. So athetoid cerebral palsy, you have constant uncontrolled motion of the limbs, head, and eyes. There's damage to motor areas sort of at the top and front of the cerebrum. So tense contracted muscles is the most common type of cerebral palsy, where portions of your muscles are really tense and contracted. That's sort of like their default state. If it's in the legs, someone might have sort of a limp. So cerebral palsy is not a hereditary thing. It seems to be more of an event that can occur during birth or early childhood. Something causes damage, or even maybe during fetal development. There was just some event that resulted in damage to a motor area. And that's cerebral palsy. Oh, yeah. A nice lecture ended. I'm gonna go to fucking sleep.